All right, folks, welcome back. In our last video, we took a look at David Miller's argument about nationalism, suggesting that nationalism is a legitimate basis of ethics, maybe even the basis of ethics. People's obligations just are particular, and if that means they want to live in a nation in order to live out their collective moral life together, well, Miller would give them that power. In this video, we're going to see that Kymlicka responds to this in some ways. And I use a plural there because he has maybe a few responses. For one thing, he wants more room for people of minority cultures to, say, get some space from the majority in the nation and the majority culture. But he may run into the same hashtag issue that some of you had with Miller, actually. Even while denying the majority the ability to just run roughshod over cultural minorities with its nationalism, he, in a sense, invites minority cultures to form and keep nations of their own, with all of the dangers of separatism and secessionism, and again, maybe even ethnic violence that come along with that. So we'll see at the very end of this video that in response to that, Kymlicka then offers really yet another solution. But before we see that, let's get into some more depth about Kymlicka. When we studied him earlier in the term, you'll remember, we looked almost exclusively at his linguistic theory of culture. And you'll remember that he said that preserving a cultural context actually enhances individual freedom because it keeps cultural options available to those who find those options meaningful in some ways. I need others around me who understand my actions as good or bad in the way that I do. And those understandings, he says, come from our shared language. But we spent less time looking at what Kymlicka says about institutions, which is also a big part of his theory. It was implicit in some of the examples that I used from his work, but now we want to make it explicit. Kymlicka says that I actually may need things like property and political structures and housing practices and so forth. That is, all of the major institutions of my culture in order to act out a life that I consider meaningful. Institutions, he wants to say, are the arenas in which we act out the cultural meanings we get from our languages. And so Kymlicka focuses on languages and institutions as the way of defining culture, differentiating one culture from another, and also deciding what sorts of rights cultural groups should really get. And he bases that on the extent to which the groups share a language and the extent to which the groups are engaged in a sort of tight-knit shared set of institutions. So Kymlicka actually kind of categorizes the cultural groups within the larger liberal multicultural nation state into three types on the basis of language and institutions, from the most distinct linguistic institutional group to the least distinct group. See chapter 2 for actually all of these differentiations. It's on the syllabus under topic number 5. The first group he calls a nation. On page 11, he says, a nation means a historical community, more or less institutionally complete, occupying a given territory or homeland, sharing a distinct language and culture. So for him, a nation is the type of group with its own cultural linguistic meanings that really most needs protections. And Kymlicka wants to remind us that, well, even the United States contains many nations. Native Americans were their own peoples well before settlers arrived from elsewhere in the world and continue to speak their own languages and continue to govern their own tribal lands in some ways, so language and institutions. And the US has also enveloped Native Alaskans and Hawaiians. The US controls Puerto Rico, not to mention other territories. Puerto Rico is nevertheless officially Spanish-speaking and politically self-governing. And as far as many people in California and New Mexico and Arizona are concerned, there were Spanish-speaking Mexican settlers in much of the West who were here before America fought its war against Mexico in the mid-1800s and claimed those territories as its own. They say that those people have claims to rights. And just to complicate things a little bit further, think about Louisiana. Louisiana is just a state like any other, right? Well, it's not like any other. They use the French Civil Code and institution, and they still have within their borders many French Creole speakers, a separate language. So what do we think about Louisiana? Kymlicka then says, well, let's talk about a separate group, immigrants. Immigrants, on the other hand, have left their own nations and institutions. They've chosen to settle in Western liberal countries. For the most part, he says, they've agreed to participate in Western political institutions and not to keep their own. And they've adopted the language of their new homes and not kept their own, at least for the purposes of relating to the state in doing things like filing forms and filling out ballots. And finally, he considers groups that he just calls minorities. African Americans are his most prominent example here. Many African American families, he suggests, didn't begin as voluntary immigrants to the United States. They were forced into slavery here. And they do not have their own political institutions, but they were certainly kept separate from mainstream political institutions for hundreds of years. So for him, this means that while African Americans want to become part of the mainstream culture, they may actually need some sort of cultural protections in order to facilitate that mainstreaming. He applies the same argument, to women as well. So let's take a look at what those special rights might be. First, a disclaimer. Kymlicka says on page 26 that the usual liberal rights, freedom of association, religion, speech, mobility, freedom of political organization, among many other freedoms, are, he says, the primary way of granting members of all three of these types of groups freedom. But other protections may be needed as supplements to these rights when the situation calls for it, he says. So here, Kymlicka talks about self-government rights, polyethnic rights, and special representation rights to be attached to those groups, nations, immigrants, and minorities, in order. He talks about this on pages 26 to 33. For our purposes, let's take these types of rights in reverse order. Special representation rights we might think of as enhancements for the individual liberties of, say, African Americans and perhaps also of women, although that's not exhaustive of groups that he calls minorities. These rights are meant to secure representation within legislatures. So, for instance, by creating minority voting districts, or simply by requiring that African Americans or women have seats in the legislature in proportion to their numbers in the population. India, for instance, tried out an interesting solution to this for women's representation. It required parties to put up women as 50% of their candidates, at least. And because of that, it ended up seeing representation of women in its parliament grow significantly. These are differentiated rights, Kymlicka admits, but they're intended to actually enhance participation in mainstream institutions. Polyethnic rights, then, are designed to help immigrants, especially, to express their cultural particularities without suffering at all in terms of their participation in mainstream economic and political institutions, which he takes immigrants to want. So, for instance, we might think here of changes in an education curriculum that teach the history and contributions of immigrants in order to sort of promote everyone's esteem for diverse cultures. Or we might also think about exemptions from otherwise generally applicable laws when those might be necessary to allow immigrant groups to sort of hang on to some practice that's central to their culture. Again, differentiated rights, but meant to facilitate integration in the sense of allowing immigrant minority groups to fully participate in mainstream social life while also still expressing their particular culture. But where special representation rights and polyethnic rights seek to secure the integration of minorities and immigrants into mainstream institutions, self-government rights seek to protect minority nations, which really actually want to have their own institutions and make their own laws for themselves, at least when it comes to certain areas of their collective lives in which they wish to self-govern. And self-government rights would also be for national groups trying to preserve their own languages, like, say, the Quebecois in Canada or Basques and Catalan in Spain. So what are examples of self-government rights? Well, in an example that I used before, let's say that Native Americans are in a position where they'll be outbid by a white developer and thereby unwillingly lose their culture in a certain sense. Well, Kymlicka says some special self-government rights might actually be required to return to them a condition of equal social power. So they're not outbid, he says, or outvoted in their attempt to sort of keep their lands, their institutions, and their languages together. So Kymlicka says that the same goes for the other group differentiated rights that he talks about as well. If, for instance, an immigrant group needs some language accommodations within schools, let's say, that will return them to a position of equal social power. Or if African Americans are going to be outvoted whenever they try to send a representative to Congress, then he says some special representation right might be required, again, simply to return them to a condition of equal social power. Now, some people looked at examples like these, and they objected that Kymlicka was really giving special rights to these groups, rights that he wouldn't give to anyone else in mainstream society, special rights to make collective political decisions that might actually give them an unfair advantage over others, especially, say, when it came to protecting their property from outsiders or setting up schools in a particular language that's not the mainstream language. Well, in chapter 6, your other indispensable reading for today, along with Miller, Kymlicka argues against that. He suggests that when it comes to culture, this sort of objection relies on a false notion of the separation of state and ethnicity, or the notion that the state ought to stay out of the business of helping or of hindering any culture, just as it stays out of the business of religion. But as far as Kymlicka is concerned, that would just be impossible. As he says on page 108, government decisions on languages, internal boundaries, public holidays, and state symbols unavoidably involve recognizing, accommodating, and supporting the needs and identities of particular ethnic and national groups. The state unavoidably promotes certain cultural identities and thereby disadvantages others. So as Kymlicka sees it, government just in general is inevitably enmeshed in the business of culture, and so-called special rights are really in fact just remedies to return society to a condition in which no culture is unfairly treated. And he thinks, indeed, that special rights are not unequal, but equalizing. Kymlicka's radical suggestion, I've told you about it before, is that people who care about rights actually have to rethink their notion of equality. As he says on page 113, true equality requires not identical treatment, but rather differential treatment in order to accommodate differential needs. Okay, but let's close with some hashtag issues that people have with Kymlicka's argument. I'll start with one of them. The issue here is that in allowing this separation, people think he's going to unwittingly invite separatism and secession and ultimately even court ethnic violence. So for instance, take a look at Kymlicka's article on the syllabus entitled The Internationalization of Minority Rights. In that article, he argues on pages 8 and 17 and 25 that there's really no reason for other groups not to claim the same sort of separate self-governments that indigenous groups are given. So for instance, he says the Quebecois in Canada, the Scots and Welsh in Britain, the Catalan and Basques in Spain, the Flemish in Belgium, the German-speaking minority in South Tyrol in Italy, the French and Italian-speaking minorities in Switzerland, and Puerto Ricans in the United States. He suggests that these are just some of the groups that may have the same claim to self-government rights as indigenous groups do. But his critics look at this and they say, man, you are courting a lot of violence there. It's not like the Spanish are going to let the Basque go easily. And if you know anything about violence in Spain over this issue, you may think that's true. And his critics sort of continue against him. They're like, well, look, are you suggesting, Will, that the UK break up because the Scots are a colonized nation, just like the First Nations people of Canada are? His critics suggest that this is all just too dangerous. Take a look, for example, at the chapters by Jacob Levy that are on your syllabus. Levy says that there are reasons to grant these groups multicultural accommodations of sorts, but it's out of fear of exactly this type of separatism. Grant them the exemptions and concessions, but do it in order to avoid secession, in order to avoid violence. Don't court secession and violence. And I'll just close here with Kymlicka's rejoinder to this. He says on page 124 to 125 of the assigned chapter that, well, he might actually just prefer that we stop thinking about closed nation states anyway. So rather than blaming him for courting separatism, why not just start thinking about the borders of a state as themselves not being exclusionary, and perhaps grant national groups their self-government rights, but allow people to come and go from these sort of semi-autonomous places as they choose. Arash Abazada says that this is the way we should have been doing it from the start anyway. In the article that's on your syllabus, he says freedom would seem to require open borders, while democratic self-government would seem to require giving nations the right to control who comes and goes, but he says that's a mistake anyway. Democracy itself actually requires open borders. So, in other words, the connection here is that maybe even Kymlicka's democratic self government rights for some nations would require open borders. So, as Abizadeh says on page 44, he says, my thesis is that, according to democratic theory, the justification for a regime of border control is ultimately owed to both members and non members. So he says that exclusion at the border is a form of coercion, and as such, it's actually a violation of individual autonomy. Take a look at the argument. It's not at all obvious. It's quite clever. If you want to talk about it at some point, by all means, get in touch with me. But that's Abizadeh's claim. He says it's a violation of autonomy because it subjects the will of one agent to the will of another agent. One agent intentionally limiting another agent's options, that makes a difference to the autonomy of the second agent. So he says, look, it would be a total contradiction to say, for instance, that the Basques have the right to control their own state and their own border in the name of their autonomy, but then to allow them to control their own borders in a way that limits the autonomy of others, in a way that might not be actually justifiable to those others, as democracy requires justification to those others. And yes, the implication of this argument here, if you're picking it up, is that at least border policy requires justification to outsiders, so that Americans might have to justify border policy to Mexicans and Latin Americans in a way that's democratic. Okay, so by looking at Miller and Kymlicka, we've seen some of the hashtag issues that nationalism raises for people. I look forward to hearing what you think about those hashtag issues in class. I think it's going to be a lively discussion. Looking forward to it, and I'll see you then.